So to finish up then with Derrida's book of Grammatology, the last chapter of the book, which is chapter 4 of the second section, but actually the seventh chapter in the book, is from of the supplement to the source, the theory of writing. And so in this chapter what he's going to do then is finish off by looking specifically at Rousseau's theory of writing. But before he does that, he gives a little bit of background to it insofar as Rousseau was influenced by a philosopher named Kandak, and also before him an individual named Warburton. But it's primarily Kandak that influenced Rousseau's theory, and so Derrida begins here, after a brief discussion of metaphor, by talking about Kandak's theory of writing. What Kandak says is that writing basically miniaturizes being. It miniaturizes signifiers, and through the process of abbreviation and through a gradual process of formalization toward the alphabet, it gradually brings writing into being as a process of formalization. And so what happens is that Derrida says that what Kandak says is that writing begins essentially with images. The earliest writing begins with the image, and that the image and the writing itself have a common origin, that the first writing is pictographic writing, and that this is how it begins, and the Egyptians are a perfect example of a writing in terms of pictures and thinking in terms of pictures, that then gradually evolves. The Egyptians also involved, in addition to their formal hieroglyphic, of course, a kind of shorthand called demotic, which is very abstract, so that they could write it much quicker for official documents. And so Kandak sees this process of demotic being an abbreviated form of the hieroglyph, and then he sees the alphabet as itself evolving from out of the demotic script, and the alphabet being even more abbreviated than demotic. So he sees the demotic, which is basically a shorthand, as an abbreviation of the hieroglyphs themselves, and then the alphabet in turn as a further abbreviation or miniaturization of the signifiers of the Egyptian hieroglyphs in origin. So then science comes into being. As a result of this, science then, the epistemic world, the logocentric tradition of the West, then comes into being as a result of this gradual process of a kind of algebraic formalization process in which the signifiers become more and more abstract and become more and more effaced and become more and more hidden, so that the traces of the nonlinear tradition are, as we saw earlier in an earlier chapter, get repressed and built into the logocentric tradition, which then builds itself out of a system of writing by effacing the oral mnemonic modes. Poetry and verse and rhyme are all basic, according to Kandak, are all basic oral forms. And the invention of writing is more or less the invention of prose. So writing comes in with prose, and presumably these earlier poetic structures are simply oral residues, in the sense in which Walter Ong used to use this term, oral residues as carryovers, vestigial carryovers from a previous epoch in which writing did not exist. And he says that things like rhythm and rhyme, which are antipathetic to prose writing, and prose writing then lays the groundwork through effacing the signifier, that is to say abbreviating it, making it more and more abstract in phonetic terms of writing, the alphabet. In effacing the signifier, these earlier forms of poetry and verse and so forth are, what they did was they created furrows, as it were, in the mind, in the memory, using mnemonic patterns such as rhythm and rhyme and repetition, which allow one to inscribe signifiers into the memory. And that's a way of storing them in the memory, of inscribing them into the substrate of the memory, using those kinds of mnemonic devices, which are effaced. The entire poetic oral tradition gets effaced then when the philosophic scientific tradition comes into being with the birth of writing, especially, presumably Kandak, it means alphabetic writing. And this, of course, the alphabet comes in about 2000 BC, and it may actually have come into being the Hebrew myth of seeing Moses coming down Mount Sinai with the tablets as the first written text in the alphabet. There may be a certain amount of truth to that, insofar as there are two theories for the origin of the alphabet. One is that the Proto-Sinaitic script, in opposition to the Ugaritic script, which tradition sees as coming from Palestine and originating amongst the Canaanites or the Phoenicians, and the Greeks getting it from them, which may be true for the later phase. But the earlier phase seems to be that the alphabet came into being in the Sinai Peninsula about 2000 BC when the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom had a turquoise mine there near Mount Sinai that was dedicated to the goddess Hathor. And at that turquoise mine, Semitic individuals were employed. I don't know whether they were enslaved or paid for their labor, but they were employed at the mines there, and they seem to have invented the alphabet. The earliest pictures of the alphabet, the earliest images of the alphabet seem to come from inscriptions which are clear and deliberate abstractions of Egyptian hieroglyphs. So Kandak's theory is not that far off, that the alphabet is descended from Egyptian, he says it's descended from the Demotic script, but either way, the Demotic or the hieroglyphic script, the alphabet does seem to have budded off about 2000 BC in the Sinai Peninsula from Egyptian hieroglyphics. And then Kandak sees then, or Derrida characterizes him as seeing this creation of the logocentric tradition, this creation of the formalization of scripts getting more formal over time, laying the foundation for science and the coming into being of the logocentric tradition, which is of course built on repressing traces. The rise of logocentrism, that is to say, logocentrism, that which Derrida is deconstructing and has been deconstructing through the entire book here, is basically the same thing as Jean Gebser's mental consciousness structure, which we recall, if you've seen my discussions on Jean Gebser, the mental consciousness structure comes into being with the Greeks and the Hebrews, and it's a tradition, it is a written tradition rather than an oral one, and it's a tradition that seems to have come into being to specifically deconstruct and dismantle and neutralize the powers of the mythic tradition. And along with the mythic tradition went, of course, pictographic writing, pictographic thinking, and mythical forms of thinking, rather than alphabetic conceptual forms of thinking. So the alphabet seems to have acted as a spur and a catalyst toward more abstract forms of thinking amongst the Hebrews and the Greeks that kicked in and brought about the foundations of the logocentric tradition, the metaphysical tradition that represses all the traces that have, what Derrida says is, it effaces the signifiers of the older traditions. They become more and more abstract, more and more algebraized over time, more and more formalized. So that laid the groundwork for the tradition, and then he moves on to discuss Rousseau's theory, which is based on a modification of Kandak's theory, in which Rousseau says that writing originated in three different stages. We've seen in the previous talk how he saw a cosmic catastrophe coming into being that laid the basis for the creation of a difference engine in societies in the North and the South, those in the North being more concerned with articulation and clarity, those in the South being more concerned with the sing-song accentuation of language, its beauty, it's closer to song. The North was deprivileged and the South was privileged. Here he has a three-stage theory in which he says that the first stage of writing is the stage of the savages, and it corresponds to the stage of the hunter, although the examples that he gives for it are Egyptian hieroglyphics, in which he says that what we have in the beginning is simply signifiers that picture things. They're simply, just like Kandak, writing and painting of a common origin insofar as they represent the thing. They're just pictographic representations of the thing. And Derrida says that, of course, this is also a killing of the thing, just as writing betrays speech in the metaphysical tradition because it freezes and arrests time, and it's fatherless in a certain sense. You can't go back and address its father and ask it questions because the author is absent. The father of the speech isn't there, of the logos. So both painting and writing in the Phaedrus, as Plato represents them, are mute. You cannot dialogue with them, and therefore they are regarded as supplemental and secondary and artificial. They kill. The word kills. The letter kills. And this is the Rousseau's theory of the first stage, the stage of savages, in which we simply have the doubling of the thing in the image. The second stage is the barbaric stage, what Rousseau calls the barbaric stage, which is the stage in which words are represented by conventional characters, and this corresponds, the exemplar for this is Chinese writing, which is, he says, is ideographic or idiophonographic. It's partially composed of signifiers and partially composed of signifieds, both together. So there is a certain phonic aspect to it. The rebus principle begins to come in. The classic example of the rebus is where the image is used to represent parts of a word. So the images actually represent sounds now, no longer just the thing. They actually represent phonemes, as in belief being represented by an image of a bee and a leaf, a bee leaf. You use those two images to represent the phonemes to represent the signified of the concept. So this is the second stage, and it's best exemplified by the Chinese, according to Rousseau. Then the third stage that comes in is, and that's the barbaric stage. The first stage corresponding to the hunter, and the second stage, he says, corresponding to the shepherd. I'm not sure why, though. The third stage is the civil stage, and this is the alphabetic stage, and it corresponds to the plowman. Part of the reason that it corresponds to the plowman is that Rousseau says, Derrida talks about how Rousseau says, one of the things that happened with the Greeks is that writing was analogized to agriculture with them. The idea of inscribing lines was originally the bastrophodon form of writing, whereby you read by reading from one line left to right, the next line right to left, the next line left to right, just like an ox plowing a field in a series of lines. The ox plows the field, and that's the bastrophodon form of writing. But that fell out, and eventually the Greeks just conventionalized it into reading from left to right on each line. And Rousseau says that the reason for that was because there was an economy of the hand that was in opposition to an economy of the eye there. It's much easier for the eye to read that way. The eye is comfortable reading left to right and then right to left, but it's harder on the hand. And so the scribes dropped that practice because it's easier for the hand to write left to right and then start again, left to right, and start again, left to right, and so on. And so the economy of the eye and the hand were at odds with each other, and that's the reason why that dropped out. So the civil phase, the alphabetic phase that comes in, corresponds to the plowman for those reasons. And of course for Rousseau, the alphabetic stage is the highest and most refined. It is the most abstract, in which we have with the alphabet the signifiers that refer to the signifieds are themselves signifiers again. The alphabet is composed of signifiers because the signifiers are phonemes. They're sound units. They're acoustic images, to use the language of Saussure, so they're units of sound. And that brings into being the alphabetic tradition. And basically that rounds off Derrida's discussion, in which he says that, of course, the supplement Rousseau sees writing as supplemental, something exterior to speech, something that kills speech, something that's a threat to it. But Derrida, of course, doesn't see it that way. He sees with his logic of différance and the supplement that there is always a certain kind of archy writing that's present within speech to begin with, just as we saw in his theory of language that articulation isn't supplemental to accent, but articulation is always already there in the beginning to enable the production of the economy of signs in the first place. Articulation, you couldn't have language without the formation of difference, and you certainly couldn't have speech without the formation of a certain kind of différance in the form of the archy writing of the granulation of language, the spacing between words that différance allows for communication to take place, and is therefore a kind of archy writing, a kind of primordial writing, the spacing principle of différance, which is always already there at the beginning. So the supplement is already at the source. It's not just a supplement of the source, but the supplement for Derrida is always at the source, as we saw last time. It's always part of the initial conditions of the system that enabled writing to come into being in the first place, so that both speech and writing are both descendants of a common ancestor, in this case archy writing, in which speech is made up of units of iterability. As Derrida says in a later essay, speech is made up, just as writing is made up, of unities of iterability, in both cases based on the principle of spacing, the spacing of language. And that really does wrap up then his discussion of grammatology, his discussion of writing in this book, Grammatology, which is one of the great postmodern classics.